All right, Brian. Brian, where are you from originally?
So I grew up in Southern Oregon, small town called Rogue River. It's like less than 2,000 people there. So
Mm-hmm.
grew up in the 80s. So just in the mountains and, no internet and just, enjoying the adventure.
That was your playground.
It's my playground.
What was your family like?
Um, Again, 80s. It was, I have a brother and a sister. I'm the youngest. And, my dad was gone a lot. You deal with things, get your wounds from your childhood that
That we all get.
yeah, from small town, and yeah.
And what kind of kid were you in high school?
I was good to fairly good. I've was into sports. I was always active, just because there wasn't a lot else to do. So I was big into like soccer and played some golf and tennis and baseball when I was younger. So I was definitely, but I was always outdoors. Just always, we lived in the mountains, so I was always climbing, riding bikes, swimming in the rivers.
What did you want to do when you graduated?
So I had opportunities to have scholarships to go to play soccer as well as art. But coming from a small town, not really seeing much of the world, I wanted to join the military. So join the Navy. My dad was Navy, grandparents so definitely a pattern of military, and my brother was in. So wanted to go in the Navy, but not just do like normal Navy, do some interesting things.
And what did you do?
So I was a aviation rescue swimmer. So it's special operations. It's the guys and girls that jump out of helicopters and rescue down pilots, combat search and rescue, aerial gunner. So did 2 deployments to the Persian Gulf during the 90s. And yeah, it was a fun job for your 20s.
Yeah, I'll bet. You decided to climb Mount Everest at one point, right?
Yeah, so I spent 6 years in the military stationed down in San Diego. And then my wife and I moved up to the Pacific Northwest in Washington State for grad school, and just being immersed in the mountains and kind of back to my roots.
You weren't a Navy SEAL or anything like that?
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
No, we worked a lot with SEALs and EOD Special Forces, but no, a lot of people mistake us for SEALs. No,
Yeah.
we're the ones rescuing the folks, or deploying the SEALs and extracting them. But yeah, moved up to the Pacific Northwest and decided to start climbing, get into some serious mountaineering. And I don't know, I'm wired a little bit differently, and a big goal setter. So I decided to climb the highest peaks on the 7 continents.
And that eventually led you to Everest.
Everest is definitely it's the highest in the world.
Yeah.
So in 2011, that was the 4th of the 7. So I'd been around the world climbing, been up to Denali and over in Russia, and actually brought my wife over there, and she went up to base camp with me. So, just making this an experience. It's tough having young kids and everything else. So it was definitely a balance, because these can be like selfish goals, and you got to balance that out, because when I'm at home, I'm very present, but at the same time, I'm wired a certain way. So I do audacious things sometimes, and, it certainly is a balance. But went over to...
Before you get into that,
yeah.
what is it about your personality or your family, or whether it's something you inherited genetically or something about the way you were raised that made you want to do these audacious things?
No, that's a good question. I think a lot of times, and you learn as you get older. I turn 50 in 2 weeks, and a lot of time to reflect, and especially when I get into my Everest story, a lot of times we end up chasing trauma. Growing up, having a traumatic upbringing with various levels of abuse. I got right into special operations to then rescue people in some of the most traumatic environments you can have in the military, and just unconsciously, seeking that job. And a lot of times, my wife's a counselor, so and I see counseling, but it's definitely helped to understand the reasoning behind what we do. And a lot of times, those that are seeking this trauma are seeking it to change the outcome that we had no control over as kids, or when we were receiving this. So now I'm in control. I can jump out of a helicopter. Someone's trying to attack me in the middle of the ocean, and I can gain control of them and rescue them, and live to another day. Just have them, whether they're grateful or not, it's in that moment. It's
just the way you're wired.
Just kind of how I'm wired, yeah. And then getting into high altitude mountaineering, I think it's just this goal setting, and a lot of times it might be going after that recognition, that that conditional love that I received, and being an overachiever. But of course, you can never really achieve that, so that can be dangerous in itself.
So tell me about your Everest story. What year was it?
So 2011, I went over to climb the highest peak in the world. So Mount Everest stands at 29,035 feet. So that's as high as major jet airliners cruise at. But up in the death zone above 26,000 feet there's only a third of the air, a third of the ozone. So you can't survive long up there. In fact, if you picked us up, plucked our bodies from here, put us on the summit, because we're at sea level here, you'd pass out and die. You can't survive. So you got to spend a lot of time on the mountain. You have to acclimatize. And just to get to base camp is 38 miles on foot. So you fly from Kathmandu, Nepal, into Lukla, which is like the highest and most dangerous airport in the world. It's just like right in the Himalayas. You don't see a runway, and the next minute there's a runway and you're landing on it or you're not. And, if you don't, it's game over. But we landed. And then it's, 38 miles on foot. So it takes about a week and a half to get to base camp, which is at 17,500 feet. So like the highest peak in the lower 48 here in the U.S. is at, 14,500 feet. So base camp alone is 3,000 feet higher than the highest peak in the lower 48 here. So it takes a while. But you have to acclimate. So as you're hiking, it's just miserable. So if you've ever been at altitude, there's nothing glamorous about it. You just feel like you're nauseous, you're just tired, your muscles are just screaming for oxygen. But to acclimate, you have to push your body beyond those elements, those oxygen-deprived areas, and then go back down and sleep lower. And your body, it's amazing, will produce red blood cells which carry more oxygen. So then the next time you can go a little bit higher and then come back down, produce more until you get to about 23,000 feet, which is Camp 3. And you can't acclimate any further than that. So at that point, most people will use supplemental oxygen, where it's just, it's heavy tanks, but it mixes with the outside air and just keeps you alive, which is always good.
And how long is that summit from the third camp to the...
So you still have to get to the highest camp in the world at the South Col. So, and it's interesting because I'll back it up and I'll get us to that camp, and then we'll just take it into the summit push, if that's cool.
Yeah.
So right out of base camp is the Khumbu Icefall, which is building-sized blocks of ice, so seracs that are constantly falling. So this is where you see a lot of the aluminum ladders tied together, and I'm cruising through with my spikes on my boots, my crampons, all my gear, and I'm attached to different ropes that we attach to their fixed lines. You attach it to anchor points like ice screws and pickets, and every day it's moving. Avalanches are kicking off, and so these some Sherpa, the local people that live there in Nepal, will go through, and their only job for these folks, they call them icefall doctors, is to reestablish the route just to get to Camp 1, to get through that Khumbu Icefall. So every time it's different. And I had to go through like 8 times. So it's sketchy. That's like arguably the most dangerous area on the mountain. But went through there. Beyond that, so that's Camp 1. Then at the top of that, and then you go through the western Khum. Khum is a valley. And it's probably the safest area on the whole Everest climb, besides, lower on the mountain. Because it's a valley. There's a couple split open crevasses they're pretty deep. Like if you fall in, you're not coming out, and there's like 5 ladders tied together. But beyond that, it's pretty much just walking. You can be off rope, and that gets you to advanced base camp at like 21,000 feet. And then from there, you head up Lhotse Face. So Lhotse is the 4th highest mountain in the world, and you climb up Lhotse to get to the highest camp in the world on Everest. So it's pretty amazing. You're just like engulfed in the Himalayas, and the highest peaks are just everywhere. It's just breathtaking.
What's the climate like? So wind? Cold?
Yeah, it's so unpredictable. There's monsoon season, so there's only a couple days of the year that you can actually summit. So you try to wedge in those windows, but you're always just waiting for different weather windows. So you have like a 2 to 3 day period where you can go up and acclimate, going up and back. But I have a full down suit on and just all this gear, and it can be below zero 1 minute with wind chill. And then as soon as it clears up, it could be 80 degrees. So it's constant, like unzipping that and managing, my body temps, because you can go from freezing to death, and then hypothermic to just roasting. So you just have to be really smart about stuff like that. But because you're at altitude, you're moving so slow. I mean, it's 5 seconds between every step. So it is, your body cannot function at that altitude. I've never seen anything like it outside of the Himalayas and high mountains. So it's an interesting process, but it's also really interesting just to see how the body responds. So I'll take you on my summit push. So I had been in the Himalayas, I've been in Nepal for over a month acclimating. So I'd already been up and down multiple times. I actually went all the way out of base camp 15 miles to climb a 20,000 foot peak, which is a little safer to acclimate, and then came back in. And, I had to wait at base camp for like a 5-day weather window. So we're triangulating weather from like Sweden and Seattle. And they're like, okay, there should be a weather window on this day. So now you can, make your move. And if you get up there and you're lucky, you can, get to the top and get back down safely. So it took about 3 days to get to Camp 3. And Camp 3 it's anchored on the side of Lhotse Face. So that's like where you see the tents that are like anchored off to like the ice and the snow and rock. So that's there. You're always roped up to some sort of fixed line, because if you go out, and people have done it, to take a piss, you slip and fall. You're falling for, almost a mile, and you're not going to recover from that. You just accelerate. So it would have been May 13th, 2011. I was at Camp 3, slept there the night, and I was heading up with my friend Pasang Sherpa, and he had a couple summits already. This was my first attempt. And I wasn't part of a guided group. So I went independent, and that's not, it's unusual, but not like overly unusual, because there are fixed lines. I'm attached, to the mountain, and I don't know, it was a little more pure as opposed to just being a part of a big group. I did share like other resources, Sherpa resources throughout, but for the most part, as myself and Pasang were heading up on May 13th to get to high camp on May 14th, and then try to summit on May 15th, the morning of the 15th. So we're moving up, and it's just a straight up climb. It's slow moving. I got my oxygen, my supplemental oxygen on, and there were 70-mile-an-hour winds that hit that night. People were trying to summit. A famous Japanese climber had died at the South Summit, and everyone else, there might have been a couple that actually did make it, but like made the summit. But for the most part, everyone retreated down. It was just too dangerous up high. But moving up to high camp, the winds should calm down, and then, we should be in a safe zone to go for the summit. So I'm about 1,000 feet above Camp 3, and like I mentioned earlier, it can get like super hot 1 second and then freezing the other. It was super hot. Even with the winds stop, and it's like you start roasting. I needed to get some water. So the system with oxygen is you have oxygen mask, goggles, down suit, like everything's pretty much covered. You have nothing exposed, just because you can get like wind nip and, different frostbite and different things. I had to take that system off. So I'm anchored off like on the side of a wall and clip in to a metal picket that's hammered into the ice wall, take my goggles off, put it on my arm, and right then my leg slipped out. And even though I was anchored, it was my reaction to like grab the rope. Before I could grab it, my goggles slid off my arm and slid down the mountain. And I'm thinking, crap. because you typically don't bring extra equipment. You only have so much gear that you can bring. And I had sunglasses, which I normally use if I'm not on oxygen, but with the oxygen mask, it creates a gap, and then you can get sunlight in, and
But without goggles, it's not a safe climb, right?
it's impossible. Like, you'd go snowblind. So I'm thinking I'm screwed. And I look down, and it's kind of winding down. And then next thing I see, like maybe 500 feet below, some Sherpa that were coming up to a higher Camp 3 are waving at me. And I'm literally looking down and waving, and they're like motioning that they got my goggles. So it was like a miracle. So I'm like, Pasong's with him. I'm like, you head up to high camp, find our tent, and then I'll meet you up there. So I came off oxygen, came off everything, and I rappelled down. And when I got to my goggles, they had tied them to the rope. They bailed. And I looked inside, and they were cracked on the internal lens. So goggles have an external and internal lens. So I'm like, okay, maybe not a big deal. So I put them on, start heading up, and the goggles were freezing. And if you've been in the cold before, the contrast of your warm breath and the cold outside, you'll freeze. So if you're skiing or snowboarding, whatever, that happens. Well, mine were freezing between layers. So I could not see. So I eventually just ripped that internal lens out and continued up. So then I could see more normally, not realizing that may have cut their effectiveness in half for the UV protection. So continued moving, got into high camp like in early afternoon, and searching around for Pasong. So you have like a few tents. A lot of tents are collapsed because if you leave them up and no one's in them, and the wind will just shred them. And found him and let him know my situation. And we laid down and tried to rest because we were going to go for the summit the next morning or that night. So on highly glaciated peaks, you climb through the night because once the sun comes up, things become very unstable because all the anchor points are metal, so they're conductors of heat, so it'll melt out. And then avalanches kick off, so you always want to climb through the night and try to summit when the sun is rising. So again, we made a radio call down. They triangulated the weather. They said it's actually, and I have pictures of it that night. It's completely just pristine, clean, just no wind whatsoever. So it's good. And they're like, there'll be 50-mile-an-hour winds later the next day. But if you get up, get down, then it's a good weather window. And we were the only two people going for the summit, which is very unusual because you've seen pictures where there's lines of people going up, and it's because there's only one way up, one way down, small weather windows, so you kind of have to wedge your way in there. So this is very unusual. So I had no lines. So at about 8:30, the sun had set. We went out and took some pictures of that, and we started gearing up, and we started heading up the mountain. So we're in the death zone, 26,000 feet, and fixed lines. I have a device. It's a Jumar, which is a device that connects to the rope, has backwards teeth on it. So you slide it up, and then it locks in. And then I have a safety carabiner. So I am as safe as I can be attached to that rope. If one of them is loose and I fall, I'm only going to fall to the next anchor point, maybe 15, 20 feet. So just moving slowly, made it up to an area they call the balcony at 27,500 feet. And that's the halfway point from high camp to the summit. And all this time I had been inching away from Pasong. And he's young, he's way younger than me and just strong. So it's, again, unusual. So I waited there for about an hour, and it was a pretty amazing experience because I'm the highest person in the world, and there was like an electrical storm way out in the distance, way below me, and I was just trying to like take some video and different things and get some water, and eventually an hour later, Pasong shows up, and he's like, "I know, feel good," and I'm like, "Oh crap!" I'm like, "Do we need to go down?" He's like, "No, I need some water." So I'm like, okay, he ran out of water. So I gave him some, and right away he threw up. He's just like, bleh. And I'm like, dude, do we need to go down? And he's like, no. I'm like, I just needed water. We'll go. And I'm okay. So you have these conversations in the death zone and you live and die by them, but you only have the information that you have, and you trust in the people that you're with. And that's kind of where that was. So we continued, got to about 28,000 feet, and that's where he tapped out. He's like, I can't go on. I'm going to go back to the balcony, which was pretty close. And he's like, you continue up. And so I'm in this place of, I have to have this serious conversation, life and death conversation. Am I going to, one, solo the mountain? Or is it more important to get Pasong down? Well, obviously it was to get Pasong. So we had this conversation, weighing out things, how was I doing? I felt strong. How's the weather? Weather was super clear. And then most importantly, how was Pasong? And he's like, no, I'm okay. I'm going to be right here. I'm going to leave you an extra oxygen right here. And he buried it in there, and he turned around and started heading down. So I'm like, okay. So I turned and started heading up. And I didn't realize like he would actually end up going all the way down to high camp, which was fine if that's what he needed to do, because everything is survival up there. So I continue up, and about halfway up this rock traverse, this South Rock Traverse, it's a rock climb like down at sea level. You just kind of run up something like that in the death zone at 28,000 feet with crampons and all these devices. I mean, it's a lot of work. You make a move, lunge forward, you're kind of like anchored into it, get your heart rate down, make another move. And got to about halfway up that and looked out to my left and took my camera out because it was probably the most amazing thing I'll ever experience. The sun was rising from the highest point behind me, casting the perfect pyramid shadow down over the Himalayas, the highest mountains in the world, which I'm dwarfing at this point. They're all down there. So I took a little handheld video, took it, and then it froze solid. And it wouldn't actually, I didn't regain that video for like a month or something, but I was so grateful to get that. So moved beyond that, got up to the South Summit, which is pretty humiliating because you get to the South Summit, you have to drop back down, which you're going to have to climb on the way back out, and then up Hillary Steps. So Hillary Steps is 40-foot rock climb, usually a major point of contention just because one way up, one way down. It's very exposed. No one was there, so I bounced up, got to the top of that. The last section is called a Cornice Traverse. You can actually see the summit at this point, but it's like, it could still take a half hour or more. It's like right there, but you're moving so slow. But this Cornice Traverse, it's like 2 feet wide. On the right, there's a 2-mile drop into Tibet. So you're looking down. And on the left, a 2-mile drop into Nepal. So you have options. But you just slowly just start inching across and, get beyond that. And then it's just those last few steps, just getting to the summit. And it's just one of those moments. One, getting to top of Everest, amazing. It's hard work. So much goes into it, but to have it completely alone, like in the Himalayan database, I'm like one of 2 people to ever have had the summit of Everest on a given day by myself. So I didn't know that at the time, and I wasn't intending to do that. It's just kind of one of these things, how life happens. So I took those last steps and just took it in and tried to process it. In those moments, I think there's things in life where I don't know if you ever truly process them. They're so magnificent. They work so hard for it. It's like you go back to that place over and over. But my job wasn't done. That's only halfway. I had to get down. So I made a radio call, and I had to practice a few times. Like I was like crying and choked up, and it was just a lot of work in the death zone at 29,000 feet. But came on the radio and said, this is Brian. I'm checking in from the summit of Everest, and everyone's on the different camps are monitoring the frequencies, and they're like, oh my gosh, that's amazing, and doing all that fun stuff. So a moment of coolness. And one of my friends who was at Camp 3 moving up to make a summit attempt that night gets on, and I had been acclimating with him for the whole month. He's like, hey, congratulations, you and Pasong, be safe getting down. And it was at that moment I realized that no one knew I was alone. So I'm like, that's cool, but Pasong went down over an hour ago. They're like, you're alone? And at that moment, he says, be safe. Good advice. At that moment, he turned to Lakpa Sherpa, who had 5 summits, who I'd been climbing with, and asked, how long is it going to take Brian to get down to high camp? And he's like, oh, Brian, 2-3 hours, and no one would hear from me for 7. So I put all my gear together, took the highest selfie in the world, and you can't spend much time up there. So I knew I needed to get down, and I knew gravity was on my side, but I also knew most accidents occur on the way down. Just you're complacent, you're tired, it's hot out, avalanches, everything gets slippery. And I took about, 10, 15 steps, and everything just went completely white. And I remember just dropping down, grabbing the rope I was attached to, and assessing the situation. And I was completely snowblind. And snow blindness is the sunburning of the cornea. And because of my goggle malfunction, you're off goggle a lot of time. It's up there. And as soon as that sun banks off the ice, having blue eyes, being more susceptible, it fried them. And with snow blindness, you don't regain your sight, usually for 24 hours. I wouldn't regain mine for almost 2 months.
So when you say blind, you're totally blind?
Totally blind. So instead of like blind where everything is black, with snow blindness, it's white. So if you put a light bulb right in front of your face, you could move your finger and you might see like a shadow go by, but you cannot focus on it. And I describe it as like if you broke potato chips and put them in your eyelids, like you realize how often your eyes flutter, but it's very, very painful. And yeah, I don't recommend it. Mm. So I'm blind, and I remember just assessing it, and some of, my military training obviously came in at this point to never panic, because panic kills, and not to overthink situations. And this was like extreme as they come. And there's, probably 100% chance I was not going to survive, but I never allowed that to sink in. I had to focus on whatever it took to take one more step forward, and that's what I did.
Did you ever think, because there's about 300 bodies up there, right? Mm-hmm. You ever think that you're going to be one of them while this is going on?
Well, I definitely knew there was a high probability that I wouldn't survive, but I never allowed that to get into my head. There are over 300 bodies up there, and I think once you allow that to get into your head, it's hard to retract that, and you have to compartmentalize. You have to find a reason. I think that goes with so many things in life. It's this, you can get in these fixed mindsets, and once you're in it, it's so hard to get outside of it. And up there in the death zone, there's not much air, and anything you do, just those emotions will just get in and take over, and it's really hard to recover from that. And I knew that, and any ounce of that came in, I compartmentalized, and I pushed it, and it's certainly come out afterward. And that's with a lot of rescues that I've had and other people I've talked to. In order to survive and help others survive in those moments, you have to stuff it, but eventually it will surface, and that's equally, if not more important, because that's your long-term survival, is dealing with those issues that you've stuffed. Mm.
Was there anyone else coming up that might have been able to help you?
Mm-mm. And rescues on Everest down lower might be possible. Up higher, it's pretty impossible. You'd have to have a team, and I would never. People that climb know that you're taking that risk. If you're going up that high, if you don't make it, you made that choice, and I made several choices to get to this point. And my choice at this point was to live, and I would do everything I could to get back to my family. And I got up and I started moving. I was at the highest point in the world, completely blind, completely alone. No one was coming to get me. People were getting in position to make a summit attempt the next day, that day actually. So they wouldn't be coming up till they wouldn't be up at that point till after midnight. So without overthinking it, I got up and started moving. So hand over hand, just slowly. I tried so hard to use my eyes. They just wouldn't work. I'm not used to being blind. I remember bringing the rope up and trying to look at it, and just how frustrating, and it's amazing, when you're in these situations, how the smallest thing can impact your heart, your breathing, everything else. And I knew that. So I would realize that, be aware of it, and then have to just slow my breathing. And I would take another step. And the first major obstacle was that Cornice Traverse. And by this time, the 50-mile-an-hour gusts that they had predicted, I could hear them. They would come up and over the ridge, and I was definitely hypersensitive to touch and my hearing, and I would just hunker down, let it go over me. I'd stand up, take another step forward. And I just remember this whole time, I felt this presence around me. It's like, if you close your eyes, I don't say anything, I'm in this room. I felt that the entire time, and I never ever thought much about it. It was just there.
And what did you feel?
I just felt, I don't want to say protected, I just didn't feel alone. And I kept moving, and I'd have to stop and get water. And it was such a process. I still had all my gear on, going through all that. And it took a long time. Got to Hillary Step, that 40-foot rock climb, reversed my gear, and started rappelling. So with spikes, the crampons on boots against rock, doesn't really catch too well. So I kind of slipped out, pendulumed, and I remember just hitting the wall pretty hard, and then just kind of inching my way down to this little flat shelf at the bottom, and assessing, am I broken? It's as far as I know, I'm good. And, just grateful. And then started moving, and I'd stop, get some water. It's just such a long process. And then going in and out of these anchor points is complex, because if your whole body weight is on the other side of that anchor point, you're doing a 300-pound, pull up to get yourself back up, or you're climbing back up to get in and out of it to clip into the other side. So I had to be very much just using my hands, feeling that. And then it was that climb up the south summit, which sucked. But the one thing about climbing up, if you fall forward. So there was a little safety there. Got up to the top and took a step out to go down, and I slipped out, and I was head over heels. And it was probably one of the scariest things, if not the scariest I've ever went through. It's go up to your roof, close your eyes, and jump off. It's that helplessness, because it's over a mile down, and the rope shock loaded. And I remember just backwards, just ripped backwards. My mask is ripped from my face. I'm breathing this thin air, and my heart is just racing. I'm upside down, racing, and just righting myself with so much work. I'm grabbing my mask and just trying to get some air and just breathe, calm my heart right down. And then I did that and started side traversing over to the rocky area that I had come up, and a slab avalanche kicked off. And I remember right away, my feet just went out from under me, and I grabbed the rope, and it burnt a line through my leather gloves. I was accelerating so fast. I still have the gloves, a line right through it. And I felt that on my palm. But I was grateful. Again, my heart is racing, but just grateful I was strong enough to stop myself. And got over to the rocky area, got to where the place where Pasong had turned around, and almost walked right past that extra oxygen bottle. And I knew, just timing wise in my head, I would be out soon. And to come off oxygen once you've been on it, even it's supplemental, is, you're not probably going to survive that.
Is there a rope that you can use as a guide to get down?
So the entire time there's fixed lines. So I'm on that rope, hand over hand.
So you know at least to stay on that rope.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't be here otherwise.
Yeah,
I'd still be up there. So I walk by and I see like this orange orb, and I'm like, oh yeah, oxygen bottle. I lay down next to it and I fumble around with my regulator, put it on, didn't work. So I don't know what the deal was. I didn't have all day to troubleshoot, so I put mine back on, and I don't know why, even to this day, I grabbed that extra bottle, put it in my pack, because it's 15 pounds, and started moving. Got to the place where Pasong was supposed to be. I called for him. He wasn't there. Figured he must have went down. But I remember just being like grateful, being happy at this time, thinking I got through some of the hardest sections. The rest is like 20 pitches of rappel. Like I can do this. And got a snack, got some water, and just started rappelling as fast as I could, which is super slow motion. But when it's all gravity and I'm going down, trying not to get too close to those anchor points. And about 20, 25 feet in, my mask just sucks into my face. And at that point, I'd been climbing for about 33 hours in the death zone, blind, and had lost 20 pounds already. And I just remember ripping that off and trying to breathe the thin air. And at that point, I dropped to my knees and just surrendered.
You lost 20 pounds in what period of time?
It's just the 30 hours.
Really?
Yeah. It's all muscle too. It's like, so you retain everything that's trying to keep you alive. But at that moment, I just prayed. And around the world at that very moment, like my wife was at a retreat and she knew I was going for the summit, but she was like woken up in the middle of the night and just felt the need to pray for me. I had people I knew, the same thing at this very moment, just felt like prompted. And then people I didn't even know had reached out after, knew I was climbing. I didn't know them. And at that very moment, all I said was, God, I cannot do this alone. Please help. And at that moment, I witnessed a miracle. Like it felt like someone reached down and grabbed me and picked me up. And I was like on my feet. And the first thing I did was like fumble around for that oxygen bottle. And I got a positive flow. And I remember the pain. It was like fire re-entering my veins. I'd never experienced anything like it. It hurt, but I had life. And I remember just not overthinking it. Just, I have to get down, and put my gear back together and started rappelling down. And eventually got to the last quarter mile. It's this ice bulge. You get into camp and I can't see anything. And at one point I figured, I'm like, did I die? I'm like, this is heaven. This sucks.
I mean, you were scared for your life, certainly, throughout this whole thing.
Yeah, of course. And then out of nowhere, Pasong hugs me. He had walked that quarter mile. He's like, Brian, you alive? And I'm like, hugging him. I'm like, I can't see. He's like, your eyes no work. So he helped me back. We're stumbling over rocks, getting back to the camp. I lay down. I threw my camera to him, and he's like, oh, looking at pics or whatever. I'm out. Like I passed out for like 15 hours. My eyes were completely just secreted and glued shut. I'd wake up and rip them open, and but I still had to get down the mountain. So then the next day, I still had to get down Lhotse Face, get across the ladders. It was still 2 days just to get to base camp, and then 38 miles out on foot. So it was definitely a process. And I remember calling at Camp 2. It was the first time I got to call my wife, and I had a French-Canadian friend who was climbing dial her number on her sat phone. And so I have like probably two records here, the highest solo selfie, and worst phone call in history to spouse, because I call and she's like all excited, just to hear me and everything. And she already heard through the grapevine that I had summited, but nothing else. I'm like, honey, I soloed the summit, and I'm blind. And then the phone cut out, and I wouldn't be able to get back to her until the next day. So I was like, crap. So she's like, she doesn't know if I'm permanently blind or whatever. But the next day, like, I woke up super early and had someone help me through the Khumbu icefall and get down to where I had a cell phone that I could call and talk for like an hour and got through it. But yeah, just super blessed to be alive.
Wow. What an experience. And that was how long was the whole period of time?
So it's a two-month expedition. From the summit push was 5 days. And then, from the summit down, it took about 7 hours, and then another 2 days to get down to base camp, another 2 days to get out, and then another 2 days to fumble through Thailand and different places, the airports, and bumping into people I still can't see. I'm like,
totally blind.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. So I got back, and there's nothing you can do for it, so it's like you just have to wait. It was so severe. And like I said, usually it takes like 24 hours and start coming back. And my right eye came back faster than my left. But yeah, it's interesting because even on like the pictures, like on my book, Blind Descent, you can tell now, like at the time I took that, didn't think I was completely blind. One of my eyes was probably already gone.
Did it came back 100%?
Well, turning 50, does it ever come back? It definitely accelerated. So I've had LASIK and different things, but I can see you.
Yeah. So that was the fourth of your climbs.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever do the other three?
Yeah. So that's the thing, right? I get asked that a lot. Did you ever climb again? And the most therapeutic thing is to get back out and within reason. So later that year, I went down to Antarctica, climbed the highest peak down there. It was like negative 70 on the summit. I brought 2 pair of goggles.
It's in your blood.
Yeah. But, I'd never want to like top myself. I don't want to be that guy. I do have a family. They have their portfolio of climbs and adventures is pretty impressive. And it's all within, the boundaries that, we all have unique boundaries. But I think so many people, they get in these safe little bubbles. I think it is, and maybe the military's taught me this. You want to push outside of that within reason to understand what you're truly capable of. Because I think most people they just don't know.
What kind of things did you learn from this experience?
From my faith, like I've been a Christian, but I think I survived because of my faith and focus. I think focus is interesting because I couldn't focus, but I knew I had to focus on that next step. I had to do everything I could to stay alive. And the likelihood is I wasn't going to survive. But I just, anytime that came into my head, I had to compartmentalize. And then faith, I had a presence around me the entire time. As a person of faith, I believe God was there the whole time waiting for me to ask for help. I was in this place and I've always been this person, I can do it. I'm strong enough. I reached a point where I couldn't. And that was my miracle.
All right. Brian Dickinson, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're back with your family.
Thanks.
All right.
Me
Thank
too.
you. And you have a book.
Mm-hmm.
What is the name of your book?
Blind Descent is the book about my Everest experience. And then I have what's interesting is because I give motivational talks about my survival. The biggest question I get is, how didn't you panic up there? And over time, I thought, my job in the military, our job was to never panic. There's such a high attrition rate because we are jumping from perfectly good helicopters to rescue people that are panicking, seeing us as flotation, basically one-to-one combat in the water or on land. But I thought, interesting, like there's never been a book on what we do, aviation rescue swimmers. So I wrote a book, and it's not about me. I didn't want a book about me. I wanted a book about us. And it's these incredible experiences of rescues that have never been told, even from like the Apollo 13 days to Vietnam to my stuff to current. And my wife is a counselor, so she's co-wrote with me because she's a lot softer than I am. I'm like, get over it, and she's like, well, no, there's more to it. But the whole goal of the book is to abstract from my training and my experiences in these different stories to help people that are panicking in their lives because, whether it was COVID or finances or relationships, people are just in these panic state. Maybe there's something, glean a little something from the people that are trained. This is their job. This is what they do, and they're the best at it in the world. Maybe they'll get something out of that. So that's Calm in the Chaos, and it comes out in October.
Awesome. That's great.
Thanks.
Well, good luck with everything you're doing from here on out.
Thank you.
All right, Brian. Thank you.